Hello, everyone. Michael Scanlon here, founder of 2020 Growth Conferences and the producer of the Cannabis Public Policy Conference. Today, we're going to be interviewing Brian Vicente and Mason Tvert, two of the leaders in the cannabis industry. You know, we're here in Colorado. Colorado is known as a pioneering place. It's a hardscrabble area where you need to be hardworking and innovative. And we've got with us today two of the hardest working and most innovative folks in the cannabis industry. Brian and Mason, welcome today. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your start in the cannabis field, how you got started, and what that looked like for you?
Kind of helped them with campaigns, and then kind of became just a lawyer for medical marijuana patients, and launched me on my career to assist with legalization and so forth in the state. So Colorado continues to be a real leader, but there's a lot of other states and countries stepping forward. So it's an exciting time.
Yeah, I got into cannabis policy right around the same time, actually. I had gotten harassed by law enforcement during my time in college, and that had inspired me to get more interested in learning about cannabis policy. And when I finished school, I started looking for jobs in the drug policy reform world, and I was fortunate enough to get a position with the Marijuana Policy Project in 2004. So Brian had just finished law school. I had just finished undergraduate school, and we ended up meeting that year, actually, and I worked on some medical cannabis-related campaigns for MPP, and really things took off from there. And moved to Colorado in January of 2005 to set out to try to legalize marijuana. And here we are.
And that was the SAFER, wasn't it? Tell us a little bit about SAFER in 2005.
So, I've been working with a gentleman by the name of Steve Fox at the Marijuana Policy Project. He's now one of our business partners and close colleagues. And he had been really looking at polling data around the country and had seen that, adult use, support for legalization for adult use really just was stalled in the 90s and the early 2000s. While support for medical continued to grow, adult use wasn't. And he noticed that there was a very clear correlation between support for legalization and the percentage of people who understand cannabis is less harmful than alcohol. And essentially, those who recognize that fact are far more likely to think it should be legal, and those who do not recognize that fact are far less likely. And the idea was, rather than, like most of the efforts underway at the time, rather than just trying to convince people that cannabis should be legal, let's just convince people or make them understand that cannabis is less harmful than alcohol. And naturally, we would see support for legalization grow. So we decided to start this project in Colorado. We started a nonprofit organization that MPP gave some seed money to. And the whole goal of the organization was just to hammer that message over and over again through, we did student ballot measures at a couple of universities in Colorado. We picked Colorado because it already had a medical law. We didn't want to interfere in any state efforts to get medical laws. We wanted to take that next step. And it seemed like a great place to talk about this situation, especially in light of some alcohol-related incidents that occurred in the state that year. So it really just started as this pilot project to see what would happen if you focused on conveying that message that marijuana is safer than alcohol. And it was highly successful at 2 universities where we passed student measures and got a lot of news coverage conveying this message, that we decided to then try it with a citywide initiative in Denver. And while that was a strategic initiative we didn't expect would ever pass, it did, and really set Colorado up, along with all the work Brian was doing to expand the medical program, to be poised for taking that next step.
So give us a little historical parameters there. What years were the universities and what year was the city initiative?
So I moved to Colorado January of 2005, and we ran student ballot measures at Colorado State and University of Colorado in that spring semester of 2005. Okay. And we then ran the first Denver initiative in November of 2005.
Okay. And that was the one that passed in Denver that basically sort of decriminalized marijuana, didn't it?
Yeah, and unfortunately the city decided to continue enforcing state law. But it was really the first city in the world to vote to remove all penalties. It eliminated all penalties under city law for possession. And unfortunately, the city decided to continue enforcing state law when they really didn't have to.
So, Brian, let's rope you into this discussion. We're in 2005 now, and the city's not enforcing laws, or has been told by voters not to enforce the laws. What do you remember about 2005? Where were you guys at that stage?
Sure. So I was pretty much working hand in hand with Mason and Steve and trying to push this forward, trying to get the city to take these measures, which were passed by voters, seriously, right? And, there certainly were shock waves, and people were very surprised that Denver had voted to legalize marijuana. So they could sort of put this issue on the map, got a lot of people talking, which is really one of the main points of SAFER and what we were doing here. But the other kind of piece that I think really goes in conjunction with the amazing work that was happening around marijuana being safe from alcohol is just the medical marijuana movement that was going on in Colorado at that time. And it started pretty small in the early 2000s, and we are starting to get momentum and more exposure around there being medical marijuana patients and their rights are being violated. In fact, they're finding that marijuana is very helpful for certain conditions. And so a lot of my role at that time was helping to defend those patients and then also make sure that they got exposure on their cases, right? And I think that really helped change a lot of hearts and minds. It's one thing to maybe know that there's a medical marijuana law, but really where you see people's hearts and minds change it is if they know a medical marijuana patient, right? And if I was able to get on the news and go, listen, I'm defending this guy who is dying of AIDS and he wants medical marijuana, but they keep taking it away from him, trying to put him in jail, that really reached a lot of people. We got a lot of headlines, sort of set up a lot of the storefront model, paved the way for the storefront model to serve those patients over the next couple of years.
Right. Yeah, it's important, I think, for people to remember here in 2020. Now that cannabis is legal, we've sort of gotten accustomed to it. But I certainly, as someone who's 52, I can remember. Mason talked about getting hassled in college. It happened to us all the time. And so, there was kind of the slow progression of medical. And then I really think SAFER deserves a lot of credit for what they did, both with a great acronym, SAFER. But like you said, that comparison to alcohol, that saying, hey, in fact, Mason, didn't you share when you ran that campaign that you had known somebody in college who had lost their life through alcohol?
Really was something that resonated with me personally because, I had these experiences when I was in high school. I had an incident where I was taken to the emergency room with alcohol poisoning at a music festival and taken by ambulance and the whole 9 yards. And at the end of I woke up in the morning and they basically just said, can we call you a cab? And, there was no authorities wanting to know who sold me enough alcohol to kill me. I mean, it was really just no big deal. Our society just, accepts it. And then when I went to college, I was investigated by every level of government, essentially, a multi-jurisdictional drug task force, because I smoked pot.
But that is such a powerful story you share there about, alcohol, no big deal, even though it can almost kill you, and being harassed by the authorities over to the cannabis. So we were in 2005-ish there. Why don't you guys take us forward some through Colorado history to where it became legal for all adults to start smoking?
We had really had a pretty concerted effort to try to run ballot initiatives to get people voting on this issue, get people to think about marijuana policy, right? Which is not always at the top of people's minds, but if they had to vote on it, they'd have to think about it. And, I continue to do this sort of legal advocacy. There was a particular case where I represented a gentleman that was dying of AIDS. We sued the state to try to foster his access to medical cannabis. His name was Damien LeBoy. He's now passed away. But, there are certain, there's people behind these policies, right? We talk about drug policy and marijuana policy, and how things should be, but we forget sometimes that there's actual people being impacted by these laws. And Damien was that guy. I mean, the state was basically cutting off his access to medical marijuana. He was extremely ill. We were able to get him in court and cross-examine the DEA and talk about how they were working with Colorado to limit patient access. We were able to have Damien sort of place all his medicine bottles on the witness stand and say, listen, judge, I can't take these 25 pills every day if I don't have medical cannabis, but the state's saying we can't have medical cannabis. And we won that case, and the case really just the judge just attacked the other side for really denying this man his ability to thrive. But when we won that case, it allowed the state to basically have caregivers, which previously were flesh and blood human beings, help a unlimited number of people. So you could now, as a caregiver, help 1,000 people or 2,000 people. So you could sell to them legally under state law, and you could grow plants legally for them under state law. And that's when the storefront model began, right? And so we started to see storefronts using that law pop up all over the state. And I think that really, not only did it help patient access, but that helped voters think about, like, wow, marijuana was illegal for 100 years. Now we have storefronts where it's being taxed. There's folks that have jobs there, and it's being sold in a regulated fashion. And I think after a couple of years of that, it primed the public to kind of be ready to say, well, if we're selling it to sick patients, why can't we sell it to adults 21 and over? And of course, a lot of that mindset was shifted by Mason.
What we saw was the course of about 7 years in Colorado. I mean, we ran these local initiatives, these campus measures. Brian had run some local measures in Breckenridge, Telluride, and with the Denver measure, and then we ran another Denver measure. Electorally, it received 41%, but it was highly successful in that we never expected to win. And really, the goal of the initiative was to force public dialogue and educate the public and to build a movement. And so over the course of that time, we went from having dozens of people in a database to thousands of people, and we identified the organizations that might be supportive and the editorial boards that might be supportive. And when it came time for 2011, 2012, and that real push to have a funded campaign to push for not just legalization, but for regulation and taxes and a really comprehensive system, we were ready, and we had an army of people around the state to volunteer, and we had tons of outreach to various organizations. We got the NAACP and the ACLU and various unions, and we worked the process to have the Democratic Party give its official support through the whole precinct caucus system. And we never would have been able to just show up and do that in a year or two. And it was really something that grew over time. And as Brian said, I mean, the emergence of this regulated medical system was critical because the number one enemy of a ballot initiative is doubt. And when it comes to this subject, that comes in two forms: people doubting it's a good idea and people doubting it's possible. And we attack that first part by highlighting marijuana as a less harmful substance than alcohol and the benefits that come with regulating it and convince people it makes sense. But you still had people who would say, well, yeah, but it's illegal under federal law and it's not possible. And by having that medical system, and people could see these stores on their street corners and that they weren't causing problems and they were generating revenue and that they weren't being shut down. I mean,
and I love that you captured that it didn't just happen overnight. It was a series of measures over time. It was a series of elections. It was a series of building, year over year, building a coalition, if you will. I didn't hear you use that term, but building a series of followers to get it to that stage. So critical. Really appreciate, I can't tell you personally how much I appreciate all the work that you two have done to get us to this point. So let me ask you, I got to ask you guys, you ran Amendment 64, I believe it was. That was the one, the big one that made adult rec legal here in Colorado. Had to be a huge election night for you. I don't know if you guys had any polling numbers and were expecting them, but as I recall, it won fairly big. So my first question is, how euphoric were you the night of the election? And then B, the next day, was every state calling you going, hey, we got to do this here in California. We got to do this in Florida. We got to do this in Florida.
I mean, that election night was electric. I mean, it really was amazing. I just didn't think we were going to win, even though I knew that we put in a lot of work. And you're creating down history at that point. Marijuana had been illegal for 8 years, right? Doing media interviews, I was able to get on with Amy Goodman at Democracy Now!, which is a person on the bucket list for me there. But, it was really a phenomenal evening. And I think, set the tone that this can be done in a lot of other states to move on and say, wow, let's see how this experiment works in Colorado and maybe consider to adopt those measures in our state.
I was saying that must have started the phone ringing off the hook for you guys.
Yeah. was pretty aggressive after that. I mean, it was really very rewarding in terms of there's a big international impact. A lot of people from drug policy advocates and elected officials and others from around the globe started getting in touch with us really for years, saying, "How did you do this? Is it working?" And wanting to come out and kind of meet with us and talk about it, and, see if it's the right thing for their community.
Mason, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I went into election night thinking that we were appearing like we would win based on the polling that was being done, and really just feeling like this isn't over and we need to use this opportunity just as we had with these other initiatives. And when we won in Denver, when we lost statewide in 2006, it's really a process, and the election is just part of it. And all eyes were on us, and rather than partying or just talking about random stuff, I mean, really made a concerted effort to make sure that we were conveying a message about marijuana being less harmful than alcohol, and the voters agreeing that it's less harmful than alcohol, wanting to regulate it and the benefits, and really knowing that we have this soapbox right now, so let's use it to get some good stuff out there. And I think that we did that effectively. And ultimately, what's fascinating to me is that while election night was huge, I would say that the day of the first legal adult sale was probably bigger. It obviously wasn't quite as fun, but it was really, I mean, that again, it's that factor of yeah, they passed a law, but the feds will never allow it. And now it's okay, there's literally going to be a transaction in front of dozens of video cameras. Marijuana will be sold to just another adult, and no one's going to do anything about it other than make sure they collect their tax rate, and check ID. And that is really, all of a sudden it was this is real, it's working, and it can be done elsewhere. Illinois, for example, is a measure passed by lawmakers that included a lot of great provisions around diversity and equity and that sort of thing, which would have been really difficult when it comes to initiatives back in 2012. But when you look at a lot of these medical laws, the ones in states where the voters get to decide tend to move more quickly and have a bit more benefit to the patient community than those created by lawmakers in many cases.
So one last question, and then we'll let you guys get back to work. Any predictions for the future? Any advice for other states looking to bring it on board? Any thoughts?
Sure. I think this is a big year for marijuana policy reform. In light of COVID and the economic crunch that essentially every state and local government is facing in this country, as well as the federal government. I'm talking to regulators, weekly that say they're really excited about new streams of revenue. And we've got a new stream of revenue for them. It's more marijuana shops for several ones, or medical, or whatever they're comfortable with. So I think we're going to see really an explosion of states coming on board in the next several years. But I do want people to really be aware that there are ballot measures on this November ballot that they could use volunteers or people to contribute to. We're looking at Arizona legalizing. We're looking at Nebraska probably having a medical initiative. Mississippi, really exciting in the South with medical. New Jersey with legalization. I think it's North Dakota. There's a measure moving forward. Mason can correct me. So there's ways to get involved now, and I do think that's going to contribute to the momentum, the passage of some of those laws, the momentum we've seen in the last 5 or so years around this issue, where I think Congress is likely to act to legalize in 2021.
Yeah, so Brian touched on a lot of the state level change, and then right there at the end mentioned the federal. I think we are likely to see significant federal change. We're really just going to be dependent upon the makeup of the federal government. This is a big election, not just in terms of the presidential election. I would say when it comes to cannabis policy, it may even be more important what happens with the Senate. If the Democrats maintain control of the House and win the Senate, I don't think it matters who's president. I think we're likely to see change happen much more quickly than if it remains a divided Congress. We'll see what happens with the presidential election. It certainly could play some role in this. Biden is never been too friendly to cannabis. Trump is certainly not a friend of, but has never necessarily been a big opponent of either. So I think it's really more a matter of what happens in the House and in the Senate. And then as more states, as Brian mentioned, are going to pass these laws, whether it's through initiatives this November or in their legislatures, it's going to continue to build this momentum. More members of Congress from around the country are going to be inclined to learn about this issue and get involved more on this issue, and we'll really have a horse in the race. They will be needing to represent their constituencies on this subject. And, every year we see more and more members of Congress emerge as supporters or really as champions. I mean, one example is Cory Gardner in Colorado, a Republican who was never supportive of cannabis, but after Colorado passed its law, he's now become a real champion for getting something done on banking and 280E and defending state cannabis laws. So, we want to see that type of situation occur all over the country.
Right. So one last thought. I know I said that was the last question. I got one more thought for you guys. If it were to legalize it, apparently, if the federal were to waive Schedule 1, there's different agencies where it could end up, right? It could end up under the Department of Agriculture. It could end up under the Department of FDA. Any thoughts on that? Is that something you guys have thought through or want to weigh in on at this stage?
Sure, I can touch on that, and I'm curious to get Mason's thoughts too. I mean, I think in general, what we're pushing for is a descheduling, so not a rescheduling, right? We want to move marijuana from Class 1 or Schedule 1 out of the scheduling system and really just treat it similar to alcohol. So whether that's ATF or what have you, sort of establishing some federal guidelines about interstate transport, things of that nature. Generally leaving those state laws, leaving the regulation of marijuana to states to decide what they want to do and allow them to come up with compacts that share have marijuana cross borders and things of that nature. Mace, do you have further thoughts on that?
No, I would agree with that. And generally, there are different proposals at the federal level for how to do this. You've got some that are more detailed, that are, descheduling and actually removing cannabis from the jurisdiction of the DEA and placing it in the jurisdiction of the ATF and really going that route. Then there's other proposals that are more about just basically respecting state laws and essentially either leaving cannabis as this, whether it's Schedule 1 or rescheduled, but basically saying if it's legal at the state level, then this doesn't apply. The schedules don't apply to it. And so that's another route, in which case it might be more something handled by each state and not so much at the federal level. Again, this might depend on the makeup of Congress. Obviously, lately we've been dealing with a Republican Senate. There's been this notion that it's got to be a states' rights issue, and it's really Republican members may not be too keen on completely descheduling cannabis and creating a new federal agency or giving more control to a federal agency. But if we end up having a Democratic-controlled Congress, then maybe there will be more appetite for that and less of a concern about leaving it to states. So, and ultimately, overall, it will be primarily handled at the state level, like alcohol, because these are state decisions. I mean, when it comes to things like time, place, and manner, and the federal government just doesn't have the ability to deal with all of that.
Well, I appreciate you guys' time, and that's one of the topics we'll be looking at the Cannabis Public Policy Conference on September 23rd and 24th at the Stapleton Holiday Inn. Brian Vicente is going to be there. I'm hoping Mason Tvert is going to be there, and hopefully some of our viewers will join us then. Gentlemen, I really want to thank you both for being here today, but mostly for all the work and effort you've put in as someone who's been a casual marijuana smoker all his life, never done anything else wrong, paying my taxes, paying my insurance, raising a family. I appreciate you guys making it legal for me to do it. I can't thank you enough. Thank you.
Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.